Well, have God's servants fared any better than these from the Bible over the past centuries? I mean, do we have any, since the apostolic times in the Old Testament, great Spirit-filled servants that made it without ever having a down day? They just kind of lived the triumphant Christian life, the Christian secret of a happy life, as Hannah Whitall Smith wrote the book. Always? Well, let's look at some of the most well-known. The great hymn we all love to sing, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," was penned by the great 16th century reformer Martin Luther during the darkest year of his life. Check the year, 1527. You can even read in the encyclopedia that year was the year that Martin Luther was utterly in anguish, emotional angst. I mean, he has a angst affection, some German word he made up. You know how the Germans put words together and form words by putting them all together and joining them. He made a word up for the utter anguish of his soul that he felt that year. And then he wrote his testimony to God's power to lift him out of the prison of his soul and back to hope and strength. And that testimony that he wrote in 1527 we sing about. And sometimes we sing it in the major key. He was singing it in the minor key. He was saying, I had to flee for refuge to Christ because my flesh, my body, my earthly life, not in sin, just in weakness, was constantly in anguish. And so he wrote this. He was a devoted pastor. He sought to bring spiritual counsel to struggling souls. His compassion for those souls as a pastor, Martin Luther, shines in many places. His sermons, his lectures, his Bible commentaries, his table talks. But when he wrote this hymn, he didn't just talk about observing mental difficulties in his parishioners. Luther had a greater reason to affirm the reality of what he struggled with. It's because he endured many periods of darkness in his life. And temptation and struggles with negative emotions, he concludes, are not sin. Kind of what you could conclude also from the New Testament. This is how Luther described his personal experience, his Christian life. He said, these are the varied terms I would describe often my life. Now, this is a man that translated the whole Bible into the language of the people, into the German language. This is a man that single-handedly, by God's grace, turned the tide of the darkness of Romanism and actually put the light up and shined it on the Scriptures and turned the tide, what we call the Reformation, and getting back the heart of salvation, the justification by faith and our adherence to the Scriptures. This is how he described his life. Melancholy, heaviness, depression, dejection of spirit, downcast of heart, sad, and downhearted. And by the way, his most renowned commentator on his life that wrote biographies of him, Bainton, said this: this occurred through most of his life, and these struggles show up continually in his works, but he did not think it a shameful problem to be hidden. Rather, he shared it so that the saints could come beside him and encourage him. And that's what Martin Luther's life is a testimony of. Not hidden in a cloistered cell going through his Angefechtung, as he called it, but the saint sharing with other saints his need for their compassion and help. So there's one. Let's go forward 400 years. How about the famous preacher I've mentioned many times, Charles Spurgeon? He lit the fires of the 19th century revival movement, but he struggled so severely with depression that he was forced to be absent from his pulpit often 2 to 3 months each year. If you collect his sermons, as I have done, and have all those Metropolitan and Park Street Chapel sermons, you find the gaps. Because he was so struggling. In fact, in 1866, at the age of 32, as he was crescendoing in his worldwide fame for his ministry, this is what he told his congregation. I am the subject of depressions of spirit so fearful, I hope none of you ever get to such extremes of wretchedness as I go to. And he left the pulpit and laid down and didn't come back for 3 months. And there is a man who knew the Bible in and out. In fact, he truly had a photographic mind. People say they do. He knew the contents of all 25,000 volumes in his library. I've been in his library. It's still there in his church. And they've enshrined it, and there are a lot of books that they're the only copy in the world of those books. And Charles Haddon Spurgeon could tell you the book, the page number, and the place on the page where things were. And he often did that. And he knew the Bible that way. And yet he was the subject of such depressions of spirit, so fearful. I hope none of you ever go to the extremes of wretchedness as I go to. So if it's learning more verses, if it's knowing more doctrine, if it's having more truth, then it's impossible to make it, because he had about the max. How about the man that succeeded him in fame? He was the next great preacher after Spurgeon. He was called the greatest preacher in the English-speaking world. He came into the 20th century. His name was John Henry Jowett. He preached in the leading churches of the world. He preached to huge congregations. He would be like some of our great radio preachers today and great commentators that we know about. And he wrote books that were always bestsellers as they hit the presses. This is what he said in one of his sermons. You seem to imagine I have no ups and downs, but just a level and lofty stretch of spiritual attainment with unbroken joy and equanimity? By no means. I am often perfectly wretched of soul, and everything appears most murky. Do you ever feel murky? Then join the crowd. That's what most of those great servants of God in the Old Testament that write about their lives went through. And that's what the stellar luminaries that have led the way in doctrine and in preaching have felt. I could go on and on through the who's who of ministry and find countless other testimonies that say the same. So to answer our question, it would be a definite yes. Spirit-filled Christians can experience emotional problems, and some godly believers will always struggle with being down. They are minor through life.